population level reporting. Okay. So in this case, the perspective really is driven by transparency of de-identified data used for coordination of care, the same data we're going to be talking about in a minute. And it's around detecting positive findings using screening assessments and additional assessments, identifying social needs, so health-related social needs or diagnoses, um, initiating a referral for assessment. And this is again not at the individual, but looking at the population. How much of the information that was found in the screening resulted in diagnosis? How many times were diagnoses resultant in referrals? How many times were referrals resultant in some intervention that influenced outcome? It's a different perspective. Okay. We go to the next screen. So if we look now into it, we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive now and look at the details of how the data is made transparent. So if we go to the next slide from here. So initially, when Sarah presented a few weeks ago, the role of terminology and standard terminology in gravity, again, it was focused on these same points or waypoints. There's a screening and assessment, there's the diagnosis, then setting of goals, then interventions including referral for additional screening and assessment, provision of services. And all of those are supported by standard codes, standard value sets and terminologies by domains, by different social determinants of health domains. So food insecurity, housing insecurity, and so on all have their own individual value sets. And that workflow also is supported by a collateral set of data elements and profiles from Gravity that in which the terminology plays a very important role. So if we go to the next slide. Okay. So Gravity profiles, just just a quick summary of Gravity profiles and how terminology fits in that picture. So they're really data elements that are collected and aggregate together to represent key resources. So the data elements include statuses, so status of a service request, which is a referral, a status of a task, which is an activity that supports response to a referral, the codes for what these services that are being requested are, the categories, the social determinant categories. Is this food insecurity? Is this housing insecurity? The broad categories. There are also dates that are additional data elements that support information that's important for being able to do outcomes analysis, such as when was a service request or referral written or authored? When was a task authored? When did this task start? Okay. There are also important relationships between resources, and these are also important to be made transparent in outcomes analysis, and we'll see examples of why in just a bit. But when I say when I say resource relationships, is an example might be that tasks reference specific service requests. This task to be able to provide a status update is on a specific service request around food insecurity that was issued 2 weeks ago. Okay, so the relationships between these resources and fire are also very important. There's the profiles which represent these resources, such as a condition or a service request or a procedure, which is really a service that's been provided. These are profiles. So profiles basically constrain the fire resource to um, very specific terminologies and relationships and requirements. Is the field required or not required to be able to support the use cases that we're defining? In this case, we're talking specifically about a gravity referral use case. So these profiles represent constraints on fire to represent and support the use cases that we've identified. Okay. And then profile data elements in turn bind to terminology standards. And this is where what Sarah presented 2 weeks ago comes into play here. For a field like a condition code, well, what condition codes are really comprised of the list of codes that represent conditions in food insecurity. Okay. So these are these are basically where we call bindings between terminology to these data elements as being critical and also important as far as transparency back into the analytic systems that are going to be used for being able to determine outcomes at a population level. Okay. If we go to the next slide. So just to recap, from a terminology standard, it's now not just terminology, but terminology in the context of gravity profiles, gravity profiles that represent observation screening responses, conditions, service requests, procedures, and goals. Um, the value sets are the results of formal governed consensus process. So they're what are allowable values that represent conditions that represent food insecurity, go through the formal vetting process that Sarah had gone through the last 2 weeks ago when we had the meeting. Okay. The defined terminology standards support gravity interoperability. They're use case design by design, they also support outcomes reporting. So the diagram that I showed earlier that Sarah used in giving examples of terminology in a life cycle of supporting a patient's care also show outcome that these same terminology codes are used to be able to support different types of quality reporting, okay, and are aligned with that. So if we go to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit now about closed loop referrals and data transparency. So what do we mean by data transparency and how does data go from an individual patient and the coordination of care for an individual patient to being able to see this data in aggregate form in analytics that might be able to be used for population outcomes and reporting. So if we go to the next slide. So closed loop referral data transparency is really a, a result of the standard being able to use not only common terminologies, but common data elements that are found in these FHIR resources. So for example, screening assessments and additional assessments in FHIR, we use questionnaire response and observation. These are transparent, interoperable uh, components of FHIR, resources of FHIR that are instantiated and made visible not only for interoperability and coordination of care, but also can be accessed and used in analytics and reporting. Okay, for health-related social needs um, diagnosis, the condition resource is used in FHIR. For identifying patient-centered goals, goal resource for referrals, service request, and the task resources used together. Okay. And then for the provision of services, what has actually been done for the patient, it's a FHIR procedure. Okay. So FHIR resource and profile data elements are transparent because they're the standardized elements that were bound to standardized gravity value sets used in messaging and exchange. So because they're used in messaging and exchange, they can also be used in the analytics side. The same transparency is really critical for that use. So if we go to the next slide, like skip that slide, that one should have been deleted. So let's look at just a reminder of what how referrals are done in FHIR. So this is a build-up slide, so just keep in mind that there are referral activities and then there's service provision activities. So service requests are issued, and you can just hit the next arrow, please, or the next slide. Yeah. So it starts with a service request, which is a referral. Then next slide. Then the workflow, the activities of status changes has the service request been accepted or rejected or in progress. That's all implemented using the FHIR task resource. And if we hit the next button, and if all goes well, it ends up in a procedure or service being provided and completed for a patient, or it fails. And if it fails, there are reasons for failure and timestamps on those reasons. So these reasons could be that the patient rejected the services. It could have been canceled for a reason. Maybe the CBO didn't have capacity to take the patient, or other issues may have happened. But there'd always be a reason associated with a failure. And if we hit the next. button. So an example of a service request might be referral for housing support program, and the code for the procedures or the services provided to satisfy that could be different. So it could be provision of rental assistance voucher, which is more specific than the code that was used for the service request. Or if you hit the slide next button, or it could be the same. It could be that a request for assistance with application for food pantry program was satisfied by being able to provide that assistance, and it uses the same code. Okay. So it could be the same code, could be different. So let's look at real world. Oops, I think did we just go out of presentation mode? There we go. Yeah, next slide after that. So we'll look at real world example. So let's now put this together. So for outcomes reporting, we think of it as a byproduct of interoperable closed loop referral support. So the top swim lane or the top row illustrates what happens at an individual patient's level. So there's a screening or assessment. We're going to be using HCHRSN as our example through the rest of this discussion, just to make things very concrete, but it'll apply to any other type of screening. So in this case, an AHC HRSN instrument might have been used and to screen the patient. It's implemented in FHIR as questionnaire response and will generate observations that can be messaged between systems, between, for example, an SCN and a CBO. Amount of time might have elapsed, and then there's an assessment by a qualified professional to determine what conditions, what diagnoses exist, what health related social needs exist, and that's done through the activity of assessment of the results of these screenings. And then the next step is based on the diagnosis or assessment. There's a service request or service requests that can be generated. Um, from those service requests, we expect to see procedures, if it's successful, procedures performed. In other words, services that are delivered to be able to respond to that. And then after the services are provided, after some period of time, there's reassessment to be able to determine if they've had an impact, if they actually resolve the health concern that's been identified for that patient. And the outcomes can be assessed at an individual level by reapplying assessments using, let's say, the HCHRSN questionnaire. It could be assessment by a qualified professional, really meeting with a patient in an encounter and assessing them, not necessarily with the instrument. It could be also documented as a status change in the condition. Might have been an active condition now, and is now a condition that's no longer active. The food insecurity is now resolved. So these elements that are FHIR that are under each of these activities are made transparent because of terminology standards and the data elements that are standardized in FHIR, providing that information for a coordination of care. But if you look at the bottom row, that same information now is accessible for population level outcomes reporting. So for screening, the um, the questionnaire response and the observations have interpretation codes. They have the code that represents the condition or the observation that has been documented in screening. The category, is it food insecurity, housing insecurity, financial insecurity? The status of the observation, the author, when it was authored, when it was actually identified, when were these screening results actually documented? And and one of the things that I highlighted in red here you'll see time elapsed at the top. Outcomes reporting typically tries to identify as screening and diagnosis resulted in interventions that resulted in resolution of the issue. But in between of this broader goal is a lot of interest in understanding how much time has elapsed from the time you've detected a potential issue to the time that a diagnosis is made. How much time has elapsed from the time a condition has been identified to the time that it took to create a referral? Or from a referral, how much time did it take to provide services? From the time you provided services, how much time did it take to reach a positive outcome? And those are areas that are metrics that are very important on the population level to understand how effective is the assessment and the provision of services and resulting in positive outcome. These are potential points of failure. It could be that a condition was identified and a referral was not never made or made it in a took a very long time to make the referral. So understanding these points, potential points of failure in population level outcomes reporting helps to understand where potentially the points of failure are and what may have contributed to positive outcomes or negative outcomes. So in red, you'll see in the bottom row, everything that's highlighted in red really corresponds to additional data elements beyond terminology that are used to be able to assess um, how well the process is working. Okay. So if we go to the next slide, so outcomes reporting for HC, HRSN, as our example, the high level is focused on assessing outcomes for provision of services for identified social needs, health-related social needs. But on a lower level, on a more detailed level, as I was saying, there's interest to be able to understand how much time has elapsed from the time that a screening has been done to the time that a diagnosis has been made, from that point to the time that a referral or provision of services for provision of services was done. How much time has elapsed for to the time that it takes to provide services, and then status transitions are very important for provision of services. Were the services provided and therefore complete, or did they fail? And what was the reason for failure? So that's an important point, not just the successes, but the failures. The goals are another way to measure. Was there progress, or was no progress, or was the goal achieved? It's a good way to assess if provision of services have resulted in the expected outcomes. Another way to assess that is in condition, seeing the status of the condition across the population that might have been made is still active, or is it a resolved condition? Okay. So reassessment occurs for evidence to support the HRSN resolution or status improvement for an individual, but that's then in turn made accessible for being able to look across the whole population to be able to see if certain types of assessments, certain types of interventions, or or provided services have resulted in positive outcome. Perhaps some were more successful than others, but there might have been other root causes for potential failures. So if we go to the next slide. So goes into a little more detail. The transparency really identifies data elements that can be used for analytics, and there are certain waypoints. So you'll see the first column says waypoints, and these waypoints are really the activities that represent the full coordination of care. And from the first one, you'll see the screening assessment for provision for positive findings uses FHIR resources of questionnaire response, observation, and fields, data elements such as interpretation, code, category, and status, and the dates like authored on to be able to do some assessment as to what was when was the screening done and what were positive interpretations. But then an important piece to pull this together is how do you use that data? How do you use these data elements? So reporting rules for observations from an HCHRSN screening have to be defined. You can almost think of those as similar to quality measure definitions. Is there's a denominator, a numerator, criteria, and then reporting periods as an example. So in this example, the denominator is really all patients administered HCHRSN screening. The numerators are all patients where any observation interpretation is positive, meaning some of the questions may have been answered as in a way that's indicative of a positive finding. And then the reporting period, it could, let's say that it's done every year, or let's say it's done every quarter. It's the same reporting period that applies to all of the other criteria below. Um, the second waypoint is when was the diagnosis made, HRSN related diagnosis. So the important elements that come into play are the condition, and specific elements are the code, the condition code, the status, the category, is it food insecurity, housing insecurity, the onset, when it was when it was detected, and the evidence supporting that condition. Evidence points back to the screening instrument that was used or the instance of the screening that was used to be able to determine that condition, if one was used at all. Okay. In addition, goal is an important fire element that's used in this, and this the status date, the start date for the goal. We want to know that this goal is specific for this condition when it was identified last month, not when it was identified a year ago. Okay. And then again, the reporting rules are, again, numerators and denominators. But in this case, the denominator is all patients where any observation was positive. It's really the numerator from the first step. So being carried over to this next step. Again, being able to say, what are, the patients who are positively screened as a denominator. But now the numerator for the second step is all patients where observation interpretation was positive and the condition code is an HRSN related condition. Okay. And then reporting period is the same reporting period. And elapsed time is important in this case because we want to know how long did it take from the time that a screening was done to the time that a diagnosis was made. In theory, it would have happened pretty quickly. In practice, if we see that either a diagnosis was never made or a very long amount of time has passed between the time that a screening has been done and the diagnosis has been made, those become potential points of failure or issues in the population level. Okay. Again, the same pattern for waypoint number 3 when a referral is made. Again, the important data elements are going to be the service request and the task and fire. We're interested in the dates because we want to know how much time has elapsed from the time a diagnosis was made to the time a referral was made. And in this case, the denominator are all patients with observation interpretation of positive, and a condition code is an health-related social need. Okay. And again, it's the denominator is a numerator from the previous step. And you'll see this pattern repeat itself all the way through steps 4 and 5 as well. Okay. And then the next step is provision of services. Again, the numerator here is out of the patients who were referred, how many had services provided and in a timely manner. And that's really what step 4 is. And step 5 is out of the patients who have actually had provision of services, um, what were the outcomes? And did they reach goal? And so the involved elements are goal and condition. And the reason condition is involved in this is that the condition status should have changed if the condition is resolved. Okay. So this is an example of how the transparency of the data for individuals gets aggregated to be able to do population level outcomes analysis. Okay. We'll go to the next slide. So what's FHIR's role in enabling outcomes reporting? So let's take a look at a summary. This just kind of summarize what Gravity FHIR's implementation does to be able to show this. This enabling of these reports. So if you go to the next slide, okay. So first is identifying outcome reporting requirements is important. So need to be able to understand what type of outcomes reporting needs to be done. Okay. So the numerators, denominators, reporting periods, timeframes, those are not new models. These types of criteria have been in healthcare for a long, long time, as well as on the financial side for a long time. But really understanding the purpose and what types of answers we're trying to gain from this is important before going to FHIR. The next thing is mapping to gravity resources to understand how we're going to answer these questions. So first is the mapping to fire data elements. And then sometimes it's a straight mapping of specific requirements identified in the definition of outcomes to data elements in fire. But sometimes it's more complex. And complex mappings are really combinations of fire elements that answer a specific question that meet a specific need. So for example, we have a reporting data element definition on the left, services provided related to a specific instance of a referral. But in Gravity, it's not just it's not just one data element. It's basically a collection of procedures where task focus was a specific service request. Okay. Instance is a service request from last week, and the task output was a procedure reference, what was actually done to fulfill that request. And it's and again, it's just the what was performed to satisfy the service request from a week ago. Okay. So we go to the next slide. So identifying value sets and aggregation concepts is also an important step, an important set of steps. So following data element mappings, we need to do gravity value sets tend to be high level aggregation concepts for procedures, and I call out procedures specifically because a service request or referral may be made at a broader level, like we had seen in one of the previous slides that I showed, where it could be a high level service request for assessment for housing insecurity or assessment for food insecurity. But the services that are actually provided, which are procedures, can be much more specific. Okay. So gravity tends to be higher level concepts that can aggregate more specific ones. So the just keep that in mind. Then there's identification of necessary mappings between non-standard codes and gravity value sets. So the providers of services for being able to address a referral request may have very specific codes, but these codes really need to translate to gravity terminology in order to be aggregated and used for these types of outcomes analyses. So this is a step that needs to be done, and typically would be done at the implementing. Let's say it's an SCN vendor that's supplying referral coordination. They would need to map to standards or adopt standard codes. But more likely they'll be mapping, especially procedure codes of services that are being provided because of the level of detail and granularity that they have is probably going to be much more detailed than what's in Gravity. Okay. So, but there's also the option for adoption of gravity terminology where possible. So that may apply more so in conditions, in goals, may apply in service requests, um, in observations. So these are kind of the two paths, is either map or adopt. Okay. And then incorporating gravity value sets or subsets of the value sets is necessary to support reporting definitions. And so these reporting definitions, the criteria that I showed in the previous slide of numerator and denominator criteria, these are typically implemented in analytic systems as SQL statements. They're reporting definitions, and they, instead of hard coding the codes that represent what are the services that qualify as services that satisfy food insecurity. You can reference the value set of allowable services, and that's much more scalable than hard coding the codes directly into these statements. So incorporating these value sets or subsets of these value sets into the query definitions that make up the reporting definitions is an important step, the fourth step. Okay. If we go to the next slide. So reporting specifications using gravity data elements and value sets are, the key points are they're aggregating concepts from gravity. So typically there needs to be some mapping to those more specific ones if they're not adopted wholly. Use of gravity data elements where applicable to facilitate automation, and it, is important because it'll save a lot of time instead of having to do outcomes analysis by having to reassemble the data, re-query for the data. That data can be basically reused from from the workflow, from supporting workflow and supporting coordination of care to being able to do the analytics, as long as the mappings have been done upstream to be able to support the analytics. Okay. Another important point is that not all reporting specifications can be done solely using Gravity. Some specifications require accessing additional non-gravity data such as claims data. So just something to keep in mind is that it's Gravity will take you so far, but depending on what type of data you need for being able to do outcomes analysis, you may need to combine Gravity data with other sources of data. Okay. Let me go to the next slide. Okay. So there are some limitations. As I was saying, not all SDOH domain, previously, not all SDOH domains are currently supported. Some will continue to be added, but some of them may not be SDOH domains, but are important for quality reporting or for outcomes reporting. So just to keep that in mind. Access to claims data may sometimes be necessary and likely to be necessary. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Native system status transitions are not all represented in Gravity. So, for example, um, referral statuses, services statuses, there may be many intermediate statuses that are important for delivery of care and workflow and coordination between an SCN and a set of CBOs or service providers. But Gravity may only expose certain endpoint statuses, such as a service was successful, and completed, or it failed, or it might be on hold. But it won't represent necessarily all the different variations of statuses that may support referral delegation to other service providers um, or other hold or intermediate hold type statuses that may not be important for an end state. Was the service delivered or not? It may be just a transitional type of status, but important for the workflow, important for coordination of care. So just something to keep in mind. Okay. And then the Gravity IG use cases for reporting are also in a work in progress. So most of our use cases right now are around coordination of care, but we're also working on use cases to support specific types of reporting. And that's something that's happening in conjunction with other groups that will be feeding information to Gravity and working with Gravity as we continue down that path. So next slide. And okay, well, got done, I think, a little early, but let's stop here and see if there are any questions and can have some discussion. Let's see, folks want to, I'm going to just start looking through chat because I saw a lot of questions coming up in chat.
Jim, there's no hand raise function here, so you want us to just interrupt you?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, go ahead, Sarah.
If you can't find the hand raise function, it should be in reactions, but it's okay to also just pipe up. We want to hear your questions on Jim's presentation. I also have some.
Oh, there it is. Okay.
Yeah, I also have.
Sorry.
No, so let's first focus on questions on Jim's amazing presentation. Just a thank you so much, Jim, for such an elegant transition from the terminology-focused presentation of May into the technical opportunities in June, especially when we consider the need for population analysis for those structural solutions. Okay, Lucy, let's go.
Yeah, Jim, that was really terrific. And I think my question relates to, you can hear me, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
My question relates to security within the FHIR construct. I didn't see anything in the slides about who is requesting, who is responding. Is that in the metadata somewhere so that
Actually,
when
that's a
things
really
don't
good question.
work,
Yeah,
you
that's
know
a
who
really
to
good.
call or something?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I didn't cover any of that because that's a whole other very complex, set of metadata and capability statements and policies that exist between the consumers of the data who are going to be requesting the data for reporting and those who are going to be responding to those. But there are processes and um, fire constraints that actually help with the provenance and security. And that's not is it's not just high. It doesn't fire isn't the only piece of the puzzle. The other part is the types of relationships that exist between the systems that are going to be doing the reporting and the
Right.
systems who are going to be contributing data to the reporting, which is not fire, but more agreements, policies, BAAs between those organizations. Yeah. So it's a very good question. I didn't even touch on that because I didn't think I could cover it all. Maybe
Thank
next
you.
topic?
So that's all,
Sure.
so that's all either underlying or overlaying, whatever the right verb is.
Hmm.
But there is a whole security infrastructure going on here
Hmm.
somewhere. So
Yes.
that everyone
Yeah.
listening to this, I think, should realize that interoperability involving gravity constructs and gravity concepts overlays has to overlay a
Hmm.
gigantic pre-existing infrastructure, which may not exist
Hmm.
for
But needs to
some
exist,
entities.
otherwise you can't do it,
Okay,
right? Yeah. Hmm.
thank
Yeah.
you.
Sure. Yeah. It's a very good. And I'm thinking if this is a topic of interest, I'd be happy to present another hour on that stuff. It'll take at least an hour to go through that one as well.
I have one more question, but I'll wait for other people to go and then come back. Thank you.
Sure. And Courtney? Hi, Courtney. I think you're on mute. Hello, Courtney. Courtney
Sorry,
doesn't want to talk,
that
right?
was much
Okay.
harder than normal to get off of mute. Somebody wanted me to stay there, I'm sure. Hi,
Hi,
Jim.
Courtney. How are you?
It's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Lucy, great question. And following up on that,
Hmm.
and I see Chad has made a note of this. One of the things that I'm concerned about as you move into the security issues, but other issues is consent,
Hmm.
as well as data ownership.
Hmm.
And we know that in the social care world, a lot of that backs up to the funders
Hmm.
and, whatever directions, restrictions, obligations they put on top of the various entities. So I think that's going to be something significant to navigate.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree completely. Couldn't agree more. Um, that's also why I try to, I wish I could have put labels on where these requirements are coming from, but maybe I'll be able to later. But let's say that we're talking the scope of what I was showing for the examples for reporting are an example, hypothetical example that Department of Health or or CMS, a regulatory agency, wants to be able to assess um, the how well, what are the outcomes of provision of care, different types of provision of care for social needs across the population using de-identified data. And that's kind of, I try to kind of use an example that's usually purely based on de-identified data and driven by regulatory requirements. And those regulatory requirements don't exist today, but I'm sure they're coming soon. And so Sarah could probably say more to this, but I just, yeah, I'll pass it on to you, Sarah, if you want to say a few things about that.
Well, I can say that the level of it, and this is like why, for those that don't know my other hats that I wear, I work like deeply in the area of quality reporting and quality measure development. And so part of what Jim was able to demonstrate here was like the cost and everything that he just mentioned in some way is asked of entities in different models or across the state or across the country in different ways now. What he was talking about really is how FHIR and how the IG can support that analysis. And again, we think about, there's methods, really like deeply intensive methods that are being used to report on waivers in like North Carolina, or we think about the CalAIM initiative in California. So at that level, the data is de-identified and able to be used for these kinds of aggregation analysis. And that's kind of what he was speaking to. We often stay so close to the person. And of course, we always think about consent within Gravity and imagine this as an all fire community solution when we think about consent. But I really did appreciate the presentation, Jim, for taking us there once you de-identify, because this relates to one of the things we say in Gravity on a regular basis, is that we identify problems at people and person levels, but we solve them on structural levels. So those population level analyses are really, really critical when we think about the ensuing policies that we need to shift the ecosystem. Any other questions? And well, it looks like we do. I did a prompt. So Jim, you're facilitating and I'm just kind of peppering in. So Jim, back to you to keep on facilitating.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I think we have Jason.
Thanks. Hi, Jason Pengelly from Unite Us.
Oh, yay. Hi.
Hi. Big fans of the implementation guide and great presentation. Thank you. I just want to maybe highlight or request, I guess, something for us to continue to invest in maybe terminology for, you highlighted in a previous slide, like what the failure reasons would be, and really getting that as a codable concept, because I think we're finding, especially as the number of actors in a coordinated care workflow gets more complex, it might be rejected for eligibility, it might be rejected for authorization if there's a benefits phase, or capacity in the CBO, right? So
Yeah.
finding out why the service may not have been provisioned, I think that'd be
it's an excellent point. Yeah.
It's interesting to think, if we can just stay there for a second, Jason, like if we go back, we can, you know, that slide you had with all the tables and all the different, like,
Yeah.
I don't know,
I don't have control of the
Diane, you're
slides.
driving, but we can imagine how eligibility and authorization and capacity could relate to so many of the different resources in the IG, right?
exactly, yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
so it's not like a one-off task status solution. It's really something that we might need to think of comprehensively. And one of the things that I want to elevate is, often we find ourselves in Gravity elevating things into the fire community. They're not just social care related, right? So authorization and eligibility and capacity are certainly common clinical care problems, right? And so I do appreciate that this community is elevating things that are helpful to me, even if I simply think about, sorry, I'm getting a call in, think about clinical situations as a family practice clinician. Jim, anything more to say about Jason's question?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good point, Jason. I think that points of failure, the points of failure that I was trying to illustrate there were really driven by time. It's time, and having coded terminology to represent time between the what's, and the what's being represented by common terminology is a really good point. It's something that I think is a chicken and egg situation, because it's useful. It'd be useful to really understand what are potential, quality measures that'll be coming out in the near future that would look at that, and then from those quality measures, be able to say, well, now let's define the terminology that represents the concepts that we want to be able to measure elapsed time between. And I think that's probably coming in the very near future.
And I want to elevate again, like, so one of the things when we think about like the next step after eligibility is like a critical status that we know is very important to CMS and states as they do waivers and grant programs. And I'm thinking about you, Courtney, is enrollment, right? And so we did talk about enrollment as a critical status or critical step in outcomes discussions last month in our terminology focused conversations. And I do want to state that Gravity is undertaking conversations about how to approach enrollment and direct provision this summer within our terminology workstream. So we welcome you to come and talk to us over there as we think about program delivery, program provision, and program enrollment this summer in our terminology workstream. And we'll show you next slides later about how to get in those meetings. But we do want to elevate as well that we've heard not just about capacity, authorization, eligibility, and thinking through that within the IG, but also documentation when the person actually got, which is that procedure, right? When the person got the thing or was enrolled in the program, and making sure that we think about that creatively and thoughtfully too.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. I think Lucy has her hand up. Hi, Lucy. I think you're on mute though. Lucy?
Yes,
Hi,
me,
Lucy.
me again.
Yeah.
With respect to what Jason just said, I think, Jason, that one outcome of what we're discussing here today will be a trustworthy, reliable, and potentially standardized database to elevate the problem of failure. I mean, your organization experiences failure all the time, and many organizations probably do, but there is no national database to bring this to anybody's attention. You can wring your hands in these sessions, but until there's a database, it's not going to be acted on either by governments or foundations. So I think maybe one way to think about what we're talking about is that there is a potential for construction of database data here that can be relied upon and presented to committees that could address those failures.
Yeah,
So I just wanted to make that little speech.
that's an
I
important
also
point. Yeah.
um
Yeah,
I
yes,
also
Lucy?
want to just observe that the entire process related here, Jim, with great
Hmm.
detail and expertise, from my point of view as a consumer, is really episodic. And there's a lot of social determinants that cannot be resolved in an episodic manner or with a
Hmm.
single referral or one procedure applied. So I don't know how to deal with
Yeah.
that. I have no solution for this, but I think we should all recognize that our attention to social determinants for the last few years has exposed all of us to how deep these go in our society and how they persist over time. And
Mhm.
what we're dealing with here is trying to reduce very complex dynamics to codes and codes and episodes.
Mhm.
And I'm not sure how we're going to deal with the underlying reality that these are not episodic issues.
Yeah,
Thanks.
that's a really good point, Lucy. I think that in response to that, it's a we're learning, as we work together, and so understanding more of these use cases, more of these scenarios, and then trying to, as a community, wrap our heads around what types of solutions we need to, how do we extend these solutions to be able to support more complex scenarios of outcomes reporting, for example, would be really the effort of this community working together and exercising use cases and examples and exploring other solution, alternatives, or models, expanding the model to be able to do that, I think would be, definitely a really good start. I don't think it's something that Gravity can do without the input of the community. Just, pretty much everything we've done to date has been through input from a large community of contributors. Um, One of the things I also wanted to mention is that from a standards perspective, we're able to expose and make transparent different types of data. If we know about the data, we can make it transparent. If it's codable or if it's identifiable, if it's transmittable, we can expose it, we can make it transparent. But that, in addition to the transparency, is going to be the need to have some policies and, as you said, some useful nationalized storage of this information to be able to leverage it. And that's where, there are additional efforts beyond Gravity that are going to be needed. National databases for quality and assessment and outcomes would be important, and it would be an effort that would need to be supported by other groups as well, right? Beyond Gravity. So we can liberate the data, but we need a place for it to land.
Jim,
I
I hope.
love the verb to leverage.
Mhm.
That once we have some data, it can be leveraged for any number of purposes. And I'm just going to say one more thought from my high horse here, which is maybe gravity, instead of getting involved in how are we going to deal with enrollment and eligibility, maybe gravity needs to maintain, or in the future, gravity should be maintaining its stratospheric view of social determinants and how society addresses them, rather than how coding is going to deal with eligibility and enrollment, which
Mhm.
is it's completely different from how society is dealing with social determinants. Thanks.
Mhm. Thank you.
I have
Sarah,
a
you
question.
wanted to?
Yeah, I have a little
Yeah.
bit of a question, of course. So it's hard. So one of the things I think, Luciana, you know this from our terminology work stream, is we do, just from a episodic versus chronic perspective. I mean, you saw this in, I hope maybe you were not, but we tried to elevate it in the terminology version of this, of the outcomes conversation. Is we do understand from the literature of like people like Craig Gunderson or leaders and the analyses and population analyses of the pattern of how social needs respond to interventions, that it is difficult to change prevalence. And we talked about that on the terminology meeting. And so reduction in severity or remission, I mean, reduction in severity is easier than complete remission and the absence of the problem. And so that is part of what you can imagine reporting on within the IG, and of course within our terminology, because we do try to support that truth. And I just want to elevate again what we were talking about earlier regarding capacity. I think just knitting together things that we talked about in the terminology version of this conversation into this conversation is, again, the global aim, right, is to shift resources and ensure that communities have resources to address social needs appropriately. And so part of what's really important, we were talking last meeting about the influx of referrals happening out of the current SDOH 1 and 2, right, IQR requirements, like all of the different screening and all of the different referrals happening into the ecosystem. And so understanding when a community is at capacity is a really critical facet of trying to ensure that you have the resources in that community to address those needs. And so our role within at Gravity and assisting the communities and assisting the national ecosystem and getting the data that they need to address these questions is something that we sit in on a regular basis. And I just appreciate that there's themes that are coming from terminology into this technical conversation as well. So it's classic Gravity to be thinking in this way. And I just want to elevate you for being a person who brings those to bear. And so for anyone in the links that we showed to meetings and recordings, that will have the link for this one, you also can look at the recording from last month as well. Back to you, Jim.
Um, yeah, any other questions? Thought I have a question. Um, there's a lot to digest. There's another question, Sarah. Yeah. Hi, Sarah.
Just one additional question that, I mean, in general, I think being part of the technology group for a little bit, I think, you know, this has come full circle, and I loved the presentation, and in the sense of you're taking us from the beginning to the end and how all the pieces in the data and the collection of the data impact, you know, how organizations can collaboratively work together and co-create solutions for their community. I think one of the bigger pieces is, you know, I think knowing how likely is it for other like state departments to be operating at this kind of level of data collection, because a lot of the systems that like public health and health and human services work on aren't exactly as, I guess, standardized.
Yeah,
So, you
I
know,
completely
coming up
relate.
with what exactly would it look like for the state departments to be able to utilize this data, um,
Sure. Yeah, that's a
even
good
though they may not be
question.
fire enabled.
That's a very good question. I think, Sarah, maybe you can help me with this a little bit, but I think maybe we can discuss this topic with more color from, in the future with more color from departments of health and
Yeah. We
other, because
yeah.
we're having some discussions. We just can't discuss them. We're not ready to discuss them here yet, but very soon. But Sarah, yeah, well, yeah,
There's also,
go
so
ahead, hopefully.
Sarah, the thing is I think that one of the interesting things that we find ourselves in, and we've actually been seeing this a couple of different areas, is how the uniqueness of the, even as much as we talk about the technical divide, how we see ourselves in situations where the standards we're creating at Gravity are actually almost really like fast tracking implementation of things like the SDOH-CCIG, because we're trying to find common methods of reporting across different systems that use different, platforms and have different capacities. So again, there's more to come. We do have some opportunities to discuss like very specific applications, but I also imagine us being in the future, like this is one of those areas where we kind of are always open for implementers to come and tell us how they are doing exactly this, right? So this is an implementation affinity group. So if there are opportunities for you to like demonstrate how things like the resources in the SDOH-CCIG are being applied in either your platform or your or your system or your or your community, we would love to know. So right now we have to be a little careful not to disclose things that are not public, but we want to state that. And I also want to state very clearly an invitation to come to the CMS Connectathon. So we talk about real world applications of what we're doing in this technical work stream and in this SDOH-CCIG. There's going to be a lot of really great real world applications of the resources that Jim mentioned at the Connectathon. It's one of the few free Connectathons. Registration, I think, ends tomorrow. I'm trying to remember. It ends very soon. So if anybody wants to see entities actually participating in like in exchange and documentation of the exact resources that Jim mentioned, there's going to be some pretty exciting demonstrations from some of the community, from some of the partners that we haven't been able to discuss exactly at the CMS Connectathon. So please come to the Gravity track to the CMS Connectathon, where you can see a lot of this at play as well. Any other questions before oh, there she goes. Vanessa, thank you. I knew you'd do that. I knew you would.
Yeah.
It is one of the few free Connectathons, and CMS really does that to try to make sure that there is a zero barrier for access, and Gravity does have a focus track at the request of CMS, and we'll be doing that on Wednesday. So please come and join us. Thank you so much. And then, okay, any other questions? Again, questions on what Jim presented, but also I really want to appreciate, we want to build spaces for people to talk about things and opportunities for enhancement. We heard that the idea of investigating capacity, authorization, and eligibility. Anything else to discuss before we adjourn our day? We'll go to the next slide at least. Oh, yeah. So if you have any questions about the Connectathon, I believe Vanessa might have put that in there. You can reach out directly to gravityproject@hl7.org, or you can write, we have our colleagues at Lantana who are leading the Connectathon sign up. And so they can connect you as well. But if you just write gravityproject@hl7.org and a subject topic Connectathon, we can make sure that we get you the information about that. I'm sorry, we're doing a lot of Connectathons, very exciting. So I'm really glad we're focusing on it. But any other questions from the presentation today before we segue to the next slides?
Sarah, for those of us not going to the Connectathon, will you or somebody sort of summarize the outcomes?
Absolutely, we always do that. Yes.
You always do that. Thank you.
Yeah, we do. That's a practice that we have. We have to create a report out at the end of the Connectathon with our learnings, and we usually disseminate that throughout the community. And it will likely be a topic of the technical call. You can just see this next slide, or we should go to the next slides. Upcoming meetings, next slide. Thank you, because we're talking about it. If we go to the next slide. And this is just, this is specifically regarding the implementation Affinity Group, but our next Affinity meeting is on July 25th. And again, the information is posted on the Confluence. I do want to make sure that I'll try to grab this slide. We are trying to update our email preferences. So if anybody is not connected or hasn't answered the current request to sign up for the Gravity listserv. So I'm going to put that into, yay! I'm going to put that into the chat, or maybe Vanessa can grab that. So we are trying to update our information regarding the email preferences you have. So we'll put a link in there. So Gravity Technical Call on July 24th. We'll have the readout of the Connectathon, and they're posted on the Connectathon Confluence page listed above as well. Thank you, Vanessa. Next slide. And then these are the different meetings coming up. So the terminology work stream meets bi-weekly Thursdays 4 to 5:30. I do want to note we were on a brief hiatus, but we're kicking off again on July 11th. So join us on July 11th as we kickstart a summer topic of program enhancements, including work on developing a program classification, an open consensus program classification, and talking about different topics regarding program documentation. And then the technical work stream meets every other week, Wednesdays 1 to 2. That July 24th one's we will have the report on July 24th. And then the implementation affinity meeting, the next one is the next day on July 25th. Any questions on everything I just noted? So it looks like Jessica just drove. Thank you so much for the links to the email listservs. Sounds like terminology types may start to attend technology working. Yeah, we're all a team here, Lucy. Any other questions before we adjourn? I really want to make sure to stop and thank our amazing technical experts on the technical work stream. Jim Shalby, thank you so much for your efforts on these slides. They were beautiful. It really was an honor to see them. Monique, thank you for your efforts. I know you were there behind the scenes. We're getting claps from Lucy Johns. You know it was good work, Lucy. Thank you for your engagement. And just thank you so much. It was probably the most elegant representation of this concept I could have imagined. It was very well done. It was even intelligible to me, who's just a terminologist. And
Thank you, everyone.
yes, and thank you so much for joining. Again, the recording will be on the Confluence. We thank you so much for your attendance. We'll see you in a month on July 25th. And come join the terminology calls and technical calls and CMS Connectathon in the meantime. And she could even follow Denise. Yes. Go team. Thank you, friends. See you soon.